The distinction and opposition between being and thinking is, according to Heidegger, the definitive one. It is definitive because it has dominated the other two, but the question is why? What is it about the Western understanding of being that has made being and thinking the dominant distinction? Well, compared to the two previous distinctions that we've discussed, this one is unique. In the previous two, namely becoming and seeming, the distinctions were both on the side of the being of beings, so to speak. With thinking, however, it's a different matter. Heidegger writes, page 128, not only is what is now distinguished from being, that is thinking, different in content from becoming and seeming, but the direction of the opposition is also essentially different. Thinking sets itself against being in such a way that being is represented to thinking, and consequently stands against thinking like an object, a Gegenstand in German, that which stands against. So first, thinking is not at the same ontological level as the beings that it's contrasted with. Becoming is the becoming of beings, or things that want to be beings, so to speak. Seeming is simply appearing beings, or apparent beings, the appearing of beings. But thinking is of a different class entirely when it is opposed to being. This different ontological status allows thinking to separate itself. And second, thinking transforms beings into its own medium, namely thought. Beings become representations that stand over against thinking. They become objects. Thinking envelops beings. So with this combination of separation and envelopment, thinking is able to dominate beings. It becomes, quoting Heidegger here, quote, it becomes the basis and footing on which one decides about what stands against it, so much so that being in general gets interpreted on the basis of thinking. Page 129. This evokes or calls to mind the idealist slogan, to be is to be perceived. To be is to be perceived. Heidegger is saying, thinking becomes the basis and footing on which one decides what being is. So these are some considerations that lead Heidegger to explain how being and thinking has come to be the dominant opposition in the history of Western metaphysics. Heidegger sees this opposition between thinking and being as the fundamental orientation of the spirit of the West, as he says, and also as an increasingly errant understanding of the nature between the human being and being. It's something that for Heidegger must be overcome by returning to the inception of metaphysics. One must return to the origin of this distinction, its inception, and show the Western spirit where it has gone astray, what the limitations of its inception are, and what the more originary experience of being is. Heidegger also observes that our understanding of being is always already determined in advance by a definite line of sight, which on page 129 he calls a perspective. This prior line of sight determines thinking in advance. We don't even recognize that it's doing this. This is one of the limitations of thinking. Thinking is always thinking from a particular perspective, often a perspective that thinking itself is unaware of. Well, despite the special status that this distinction has, Heidegger begins by elucidating the distinction between being and thinking in the same way in which he elucidated the first two distinctions, namely by asking about the meaning of the contrast term to being. In this case, by asking the question, what is thinking? What does it mean to think? And first of all, Heidegger discusses the interpretation of thinking as representing or representation. In order to do this, he starts by examining various modern commonplace uses of think and its cognates. In these commonplaces, to think means to devise. To think means to plan. To think means to set one's sights on. To think means to remind. To think means to picture. To think means to imagine. To think means to have an opinion. And to think means to deliberate. In these contemporary linguistic usages, thinking always corresponds to representation. And we can separate out the predicate or the prefix here. And this brings to the fore that representation obviously refers to a more basic presentation. And this is going to remind us, of course, of the coming to presence. That's the characteristic of being, according to the Greeks. But now, evidently, something else has come to take precedence over this coming to presence, or presentation, namely representation. And the key difference for Heidegger is that representation occurs through our own human freedom and of our own accord. We set something before ourselves. We posit something, as a long philosophical tradition has it. And literally, usually the English term to posit something in German would be sich setzen, to set before oneself. Right? That's represent. We set this before ourselves. This generates an image as if you were, given a package by a mail carrier. You receive the package, it's presented to you, and then you represent it. You present it before yourself when you sit down at your kitchen table and put the package before yourself and open it up, right? That's a very literalistic kind of understanding of this. But of course, this idea of representation is meant to capture some kind of mental act as a fundamental act of thinking. And representation here has three aspects or characteristics. First of all, the free behavior of representing. It's characteristic of representational thinking, or the representational interpretation of thinking, that representation is something that we freely decide to do. Descartes, for example, is quite explicit about this in the Meditations, where he blames us for errors because we have willed to represent something to ourselves as true, to affirm it, when we could have withheld our will, our act of will, from the representation. But there's always going to be some idea that there's a spontaneous faculty of the mind that is freely representing this idea or representation of whatever form, image, even an act of will in some accounts, but that's freely representing this to ourselves. The second is the idea of an analytical connection. And Heidegger's a little bit vague about this, but the idea of an analytical connection naturally is associated with the process of abstraction, whereby we break down the contents of our perception and we select out certain elements, we abstract them from the concrete particulars that we perceive, and we connect these with others to form concepts. That would be an example of an analytical connection. We connect also our representations through logic, which is the next aspect of the modern conception of thinking that we'll be talking about. as well. But there's this idea that there's an analytical connection. And this also is going to involve some kind of activity of the mind on most accounts as well. And then third, comprehension of the universal. Comprehension of the universal. And here we very naturally think of the account of Aristotelians or Thomists, of the way in which the mind abstracts the form, the substantial form from a particular object, and in that way is able to comprehend the universal. But there are other forms that this could take. We could think of the way in which, according to Plato, one is able to rise to the level of contemplation of the transcendent forms. That's representing something to oneself. And that involves, again, a kind of act of free behavior or free will. Okay, so those are the three aspects or characteristics of representation. We have, once again, the free behavior representing the analytical connection and the comprehension of the universal. That's a characteristic modern picture of or interpretation of what thinking is, representation. Is this an adequate conception of thinking? First, Heidegger observes that this account doesn't yet make clear why thinking should be the fundamental orientation toward being. If this is thinking, what makes it the fundamental orientation towards being, as opposed to, for example, willing or desiring or feeling? This has actually led some philosophers to try to interpret willing, desiring, and feeling as just other forms of representation. But generally speaking, those have been recognized as distinct faculties of the mind as they're often described. So we have the representational faculty or the cognitive faculty, and then we have willing and desiring, belonging perhaps to an appetitive faculty of the appetites, feeling belonging to a kind of sensible faculty or sensibility. Why aren't those the basic ways in which we relate to being? Philosophers have sometimes asked those questions and opposed representational views to, let's say, a sensibility-based view that says that fundamentally we relate to being through feeling, not through representation. So this is an issue that's going to arise if one holds simultaneously that thinking is the privileged relationship to being, and that thinking is to be interpreted as representation. The question is going to arise, well, if you interpret it this way as representation, why should thinking be the fundamental orientation towards being, and rather not willing or desiring or feeling? For Heidegger, the fundamental error here, though, the deep error, is that it's not really a question of how we relate to beings, but rather what belongs originally to being itself. And he would agree that thinking belongs originally to being itself. But the problem is the representational interpretation of thinking doesn't enable us to see this. We can't see how thinking belongs to being itself. And so you get the possibility of things, for example, like Cartesian skepticism, where we can affirm the reality of representations, but we can't affirm the reality of being in general from that. The representational concept of being restricts and limits our ability to see that thinking belongs originally to being itself. So that gives us a sense of where Heidegger is going to be going here. He wants to show how it is that thinking belongs originally to being itself. At the same time, it gives us a sense of why he thinks this representational concept of thinking is an inadequate one. So this leads us to our first discussion question. First discussion question: is representation, that is the mind's representing objects to itself, is that an adequate definition or description of what thinking consists of? Why or why not? What, if any, valid criticisms does or could Heidegger make of the conception of thinking as representation? What alternative conceptions of thinking are there? So once again, first discussion question, is representation, that is the mind's representing of objects to itself, an adequate definition or description of what thinking consists of? Why or why not? What, if any, valid criticisms does or could Heidegger make of the conception of thinking as representation? What alternative conceptions of thinking are there? Heidegger next turns to the logical conception of thinking for an answer to the question of the essence of thinking. This is older, more venerable, and goes back to the Greeks. He characterizes logic as the doctrine of the rules of thinking and the forms of what is thought, page 132. Clearly, for Heidegger, Western pride in the science of logic has led to complacence. Because of its antiquity, logic is regarded as a secure and trustworthy science. Because of its supposed purity, that is, its formality, it's regarded as unadulterated or uncorrupted by worldviews, hence accepted by all, no matter what the content of their beliefs, their particular differing views, and intellectual tendencies. Here, Heidegger says a gratifying agreement prevails, right? You and I may disagree about the substance of our philosophical, political, religious, whatever beliefs, but at least we agree about the logical ground rules that we would use to argue for those beliefs. A gratifying agreement prevails, at least in logic. And this leads to a kind of puffed up sense of superiority in logic. Well, nevertheless, Heidegger goes on to ask, what do we mean by logic? Logic, this is short for the episteme logicae, which is the science of the logos, literally. The science, episteme logicae, is the science of the logos. So what's this? What's the logos? That's the question. What is logos referred to here? And according to Heidegger, in Western metaphysics, this has come to refer to the assertion. Maybe in a more modern sense, we could relate this also to the proposition. The logos is the assertion. This is puzzling, however. Logic was supposed to be the science of thinking. What does assertion have to do with thinking? Ponder that for a second. Why assume that thinking is a matter of assertion? They seem to be different things. Recall that earlier Heidegger listed a whole set of predicates or characteristics of thinking according to ordinary modern conceptions, where thinking is related to devising, planning, setting one's sights on, reminding, picturing, imagining, having an opinion, deliberating. And assertion, to assert, is not mentioned in that list that was just read. It's far from clear that thinking is the same thing as assertion. They seem, in fact, to be quite distinct. It's highly questionable for logic to be regarded as the way to define thinking without further ado, as Heidegger says. It's not obvious, it's not self-evident. So how did the West come to regard the logical as the mark of thinking? Sometimes logical reasoning is used synonymously with correct thinking. Now, if this were all that was meant by logic, then Heidegger would have no problem with it as an interpretation of thinking, because he's all in favor of correct thinking. The problem, of course, comes in determining what correct thinking involves. Let's look on page 133, center of the page. Heidegger says, in the service of thinking, we seek to attain precisely that which determines the essence of thinking, aletheia and phusis, being as unconcealment. And this is precisely what was lost due to logic. So, correct thinking, great. We should strive for correct thinking. What is that? Well, what are we seeking in and through thought, through thinking? Heidegger says what we're seeking is aletheia and phusis, right? The unconcealing, appearing, coming to presence, and coming to a stand in its constancy that constitutes being. That's what thinking should give us. And logic precisely misses that, according to Heidegger. So he's laying his cards on the table here in this quotation from page 133. The essence of thinking is the same as the essence of being, namely phusis and aletheia, or unconcealment. In other words, genuine or essential thinking is the unconcealment of being. This is what genuine or essential thinking is, namely the unconcealment of being. So the question is logic that? Is logic the unconcealment of being? And Heidegger's account is going to say no. To construe thinking as assertion is precisely to close off the possibility of genuine thinking. So, how then did logic come to be misinterpreted as not only genuine thinking, but as almost the exclusive form of thinking? The fact that it has leads Heidegger naturally on a search to uncover the historical development by which thinking was transformed into logic. He answers this way, that on page 133, quote, "When Greek philosophy comes to an end and becomes a matter of schools, organization, and technique, logic is an invention of school teachers, not philosophers." One thing this suggests is that thinking for Heidegger is more of an art rather than a technique. It's not something that can be taught by rote in a school. Thinking is rather an art that perhaps you can apprentice to be a thinker, but it can't be taught. It's more like the way in which one artist would apprentice to another artist, rather than the way in which one would learn to do, let's say, calculus by hiring a calculus tutor. And so when the original period of Greek philosophy, the pre-Socratic period, was later superseded by Plato and Aristotle, you had the establishment of schools of philosophy, the Academy and the Lyceum. And then later on, in the broader sets of schools, you had the various Hellenistic schools, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and the rest. And it's in that development, Heidegger says, that logic came to be developed as this technique that was employed by the schools, and genuine thinking as the unconcealment of being was forgotten. Logic as a science, as the exposition of the formal rules of thinking, became possible only once the separation of being from thinking had already taken place. And as a consequence, logic can never clarify the origin of the separation. It's similar in this respect to what Heidegger had said earlier in discussing the grammar and etymology of being, that modern linguistics, can't really tell us what the origin of the word being was and what experience at the inception of Western civilization gave us our word. Rather, it can only tell us more superficial things. And logic has a similar condition for Heidegger. Logic itself is in need of clarification regarding its origin and its claim to supply the definitive interpretation of thinking. So Heidegger restricts himself to three key questions about logic. This is on page 134. Why could something like logic come about in the Platonic school? And why did it have to come about? What was the doctrine of thinking? Why was this doctrine of thinking a doctrine of logos in the sense of assertion? What are the grounds for the position of power held by the logical? A position of power that progressively and constantly expands until it finally expresses itself in the following proposition of Hegel. Quoting Hegel, quote, "The logical is the absolute form of truth, and what is more, it is also pure truth itself." So we can summarize these as the questions of, one, the possibility and necessity of its rise within Platonism. Two, the question of why did assertion become equated with the logos, which became equated with thinking. And three, the question of the ground of this absolute claim to truth that logic has come to put forth as sort of its standard claim. Okay, so this leads us to the second discussion question. What do we mean when we speak of logical reasoning? How would we define it? Is logical reasoning an adequate definition or description of what thinking consists of? Does logic have a legitimate claim to absolute truth? Why or why not? What, if any, valid criticisms does Heidegger make of the conception of thinking as logic? What alternative conceptions of thinking are there or might there be? So, second discussion question, what do we mean when we speak of logical reasoning? How would we define it? Is logical reasoning an adequate definition or description of what thinking consists of? Does logic have a legitimate claim to absolute truth? Why or why not? What, if any, valid criticisms does Heidegger make of the conception of thinking as logic? What alternative conceptions of thinking are there or might there be? In asking about the rise of the logos to this preeminent position, of course, we have to go back to the Greeks. And at this point, Heidegger begins his main account of the intertwining of being with thinking in the history of the West. First, Heidegger will spend a great deal of time examining the original connection between physis and logos. So these are sort of the stages of this intertwining story, intertwining of being and thinking. The first stage is going to be the original connection, or unity, we could say, of physis and logos. According to Heidegger, at the beginning of philosophy, we find an original connection between physis and logos, and we'll spend this video and the next on his account of this connection, which he gleans from a number of pre-Socratic texts, including Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Sophocles. And following this, Heidegger will give his account of the causes for the separation or the disjoining of physis and logos. So that's the second stage. After this original connection or unity, we get the separation or disjoining of physis and logos. So we need to tell that story next, once we've spent some time explicating what this original connection is that he sees. We'll talk about the process whereby the separation or disjoining of physis and logos occurred, and we'll be concerned with this in the second to last video in this series. And also in this video, we'll see, the second to last video that is, not this one, we'll see how Heidegger reconstructs the Platonic interpretation of being as idea, and this is kind of the third stage here. The Platonic interpretation of being as idea and the logical essence of thinking. and the rule of logic over being, all from Plato. So that's the third stage. So this is what we're going to be going through in the next few videos, including this one. The story of the intertwining of being and thinking in the West, beginning with this original connection or unity of phusis and logos, then the separating and disjoining of phusis and logos, and then finally the Platonic interpretation of which included the ideas of being as idea, the logical as the essence of thinking, and the rule of logic over being. To see the original connection between phusis and logos, Heidegger advises us that we will need to shed our preconception that logos, which is the noun substantive, and its cognate legein, which is the verb infinitive, refer to what we are used to thinking of them referring to, namely to understanding and rationality. So this is basically the noun form and the verb form. We think of this as referring to rationality, reason, understanding, something like that. So this is the familiar hackneyed understanding of these words logos and legein, these Greek words. And Heidegger says that what we need to do is just unlearn this reflexive interpretation of what logos and legein mean and consider them again with fresh eyes as if we were counting these terms for the first time and we had to explain and understand them only by looking at their Greek context. Of course, in our case, that's Greek context translated through a German interpretation and translated through an English interpretation of the German interpretation. But nonetheless, that's what we're talking about here. So originally, we're told by historians that the logos meant the word and legein meant to talk or to engage in disclosure. So this is the sort of the etymology, right? We'll call this the conventional etymology. Logos is word and legein to talk, to discourse. So this is what we're told was the original meaning of these words. And again, Heidegger is going to say, of course, you can already anticipate this. No, that wasn't the original meaning of these words for him. This came later. Instead, what Heidegger is going to do is he's going to connect legein with a more primitive action, namely to gather or to bring together. This notion of gathering or bringing together. This is the Heideggerian interpretation of the primitive or originary meaning of legein. Not talk or discourse, and certainly not to reason. So it's gathering, just in the sense of gathering berries or sheep or firewood or other modes of gathering. This is the more original sense than legein in the sense of linguistic discourse or language in general. So the question for Heidegger is going to be, what does phusis have to do with this gathering? What's the connection between legein and phusis in this sense? Phusis in the sense, of course, of the emerging, abiding sway that comes to presence and maintains constancy and manifests itself in the struggle with becoming and seeming and all the rest of it that we've discussed in previous videos, previous chapters. So what does phusis have to do with this gathering? What does phusis and the logos have to do with one another? For assistance in answering this question, Heidegger turns to Heraclitus. He considers several fragments in which Heraclitus uses the term logos, which Heidegger leaves untranslated in order to glean its meaning from the context. From the initial two fragments, Heidegger notes that Heraclitus sees the logos is something that the mass of human beings, the hoi polloi, this term, this is actually an English word, basically the unwashed masses, right? That's the hoi polloi, the masses. The mass of human beings are generally oblivious to the logos, right? So it's a question mark. The hoi polloi, when it comes to the logos, in the sense of gathering, bringing together, is clueless. The masses are ignorant masses. Heraclitus says that these fragments that appear on 140 and 141, which I won't read, but of course you'll want to consult them. In these fragments, Heidegger notes that Heraclitus sees the logos as something that the mass of human beings are generally oblivious of. They hear, but they do not comprehend it. It is concealed from them. Instead, the mass live as if each had his own understanding. This is Heidegger's unconventional translation of a well-known fragment of Heraclitus that says, each must follow what is common, but while the logos is common, the many live as if each had his own understanding. Heidegger glosses this logos that is forever looked or missed by the hoi polloi as the together of beings that gathers them, that holds sway in constancy. So if legein is to gather, being together, and the logos is the together of beings, the together that gathers them and holds sway in constancy. That's the logos. Or another way to put it, that Heidegger puts it, logos is, quote, the gathering gatheredness, that which originally gathers. The gathering gatheredness, that which originally gathers. I think you have to say that a few times until the initial sort of superficial eccentricity of it wears off. The gathering gatheredness, that's the sense of this together. The gathering gatheredness that originally gathers. In the fragments that Heidegger discusses, Heraclitus emphasizes the connection of the logos with hearing. It's something audible. So on page 142, fragment 50 says, this is Heidegger quoting Heraclitus, if you have not heard from me but logos, then it is wise to say accordingly, all is one. Heidegger glosses this. Here logos is surely taken as something audible. If you have heard not me, but logos, then it is wise to say accordingly, all is one. If you have heard not me, but logos, then it is wise to say accordingly, all is one. Logos is something heard. And this has been one of the things that has suggested the conventional interpretation of logos as word, as the word. Whereas Heidegger wants to emphasize the, for him, more original meaning of gathering together. So he boldly asserts on page 142, logos does not mean discourse and does not mean word. Rather, it means constant gathering. Constant gathering. And so you think here of the constancy of phusis, right? Phusis is the emerging, abiding sway. So there's a constancy whereby it comes to presence, which we've already stipulated is a constancy that is a kind of dynamic constancy because it involves this struggle or this internal opposition between concealment and unconcealment. So here he's adding to this that this gathering that is the logos is the constant gathering. The constant gathering that as it were, holds beings together in the face of the opposite that it's struggling with, namely to pull things apart. Now, there's an important distinction here to be made, though. We've said that logos involves hearing, but hearing is to be distinguished from hearkening. Hearkening in the sense of, maybe from the Christmas carol, hark, the herald angel sings, right? Hark, who goes there? Hark in the sense of, pay attention. Achtung in German, right? Hearkening, attention. To hear something is not to attend to it. You can hear, let's say, the background music being played through the speaker at the big box store. But if someone asked you, what songs did you just hear? Put it this way, if you're exiting the big box store and someone asked you, did you hear any music coming through the speakers? You would probably, without skipping a beat, say, yes, I heard something. There's music playing in the speakers, 100%, I'm sure. And then if they asked you, well, what was playing? What were the songs? Sometimes you might remember, but oftentimes you would have to say, well, I couldn't tell you, right? You were hearing, but you weren't hearkening. Human beings do indeed hear, but they do not hearken. They do not grasp the logos. That's the doctrine of Heraclitus, according to Heidegger. So what is it to hearken to the logos? Heidegger explains that this has nothing to do with the ear and the glib tongue, but instead means obediently following what logos is. Obediently following what logos is. Namely, the gatheredness of beings themselves. Incidentally, the Latin root that is responsible for our word obedience and obey and the various forms of that word means literally to listen. Right? So we might also make a distinction here between hearing and listening. Could be another way perhaps to think about this distinction. I can hear what you're saying, but I'm not really listening to you. Right? I hear that you're speaking, but my mind is elsewhere. Right? That's why he says this has nothing to hearken to the logos has nothing to do with the ear and the glib tongue. I can pick up clues from what you're saying and even have a meaningless, superficial conversation with you that I'm not really paying attention to. Right? So Heidegger is saying that all of this is totally foreign to hearkening to the logos. Hearkening is related to hearing, though, in that there's a distinction between true hearing or genuine hearing or authentic hearing and a kind of phony or ersatz form of hearing. Heidegger says we can only truly hear when we are already hearkening. In other words, you can hear words and discourse and still not get it. That is the logos. You don't get the logos. You don't get the gathering together of beings that is happening, as it were, in your presence, but you're not present to it. The gathering together of beings happens in words, but it doesn't register. Those words don't register with you. So Heidegger goes on to describe this as a state of absent presence. Absent presence. Human beings are in the midst of beings, and we're present in their midst, and yet they are absent. This evokes, I think, the idea probably of absent-mindedness, which is not totally off base here. if you think of it in the contrast to mindfulness, in the sense of a mindful attentiveness to what's there in front of you. This absent presence or absent-mindedness is a kind of lack of attentiveness to what's in front of you, which might be either through a numbness or self-stupefaction. A form of hypnosis is when you mindlessly perform routine tasks, right? So, driving to work or school, your normal path, your normal routine, and not really paying attention, not even really aware that you were driving. Your mind is elsewhere, right? That's absent presence. Or daydreaming about past or future instead of paying attention to what's right in front of you. But for Heidegger, of course, as always, there's a deeper significance to this. The absence here is first and foremost an absence of being, not beings. Human beings live in oblivion and forgetfulness, not so much of beings, but of the being of beings. So on 144, right in the middle of the page, he says, human beings continually have to do with being, and yet it is alien to them. Remember, we continually have to do with being because we have to have some understanding of being in order to be able to distinguish between what is and what isn't, right? So we continually have to do with being, but having to do with it doesn't mean being present to it or being cognizant of it or being in a state of hearkening to it. Human beings continually have to do with being, and yet it is alien to them. They have to do with being inasmuch as they constantly relate to beings, but it is alien to them inasmuch as they turn away from being, because they do not grasp it at all. Instead, they believe that beings are only beings and nothing further. We treat beings, he goes on to say, graspingly. He uses the term Eigensinn for this, which is translated here as caprice. But the sense here is sort of own sense. Own. We might just translate this as ownness. Ownness, he talks about this as caprice. We treat it capriciously. Capriciousness. This kind of careless attitude. We might think here of our disposable culture or our shopping culture as an extreme example of this. We treat things as disposable, as beings to be manipulated and controlled according to the arbitrary and capricious purposes of our own will, instead of paying attention to their being. That's the Eigensinn here, or the capriciousness. For Heraclitus, on Heidegger's reading, logos is the same as being, as phusis. Phusis and logos are the same. So phusis, we can begin our list here of related Greek terms that for Heraclitus on Heidegger's reading all essentially mean the same. We have phusis, which is the ever-emerging sway that comes to a stand in presence and constancy and unconcealment. Then logos adds to this the gathering together from itself of what stands straight and prominent in itself. But fundamentally, these two refer to the same thing, being. So the ever-emerging sway that comes to a stand in presence and constancy and unconcealment, that gathers together from itself what stands straight and prominent in itself. Two different inflections of being, two different words. There are other Heraclitean words for beings as well. One is zoonon, which is normally translated as the same. But the same here doesn't normally would be translated as universal. Heidegger translates it the same. It could be translated as the same too. What gathers everything together in itself and holds it together. That's what the same does. So it's similar to the logos, right? The logos is the same. The same is the gathering of everything together that holds everything together. It's not the universal in the sense of this abstraction in Heraclitus, according to Heidegger. Then there's this word polemos, which we talked about before, often translated as war. This is the struggle or the strife, the striving, struggle, the striving, the strife, which is a form of gathering together. What Heraclitus meant by this, according to Heidegger, was the gathering together of the highest opposed striving. So again, these are all connected, meaning the same. And then kalan, which is beauty, and Heidegger glosses this as coming to presence in seeming. So we go back to seeming again here. Kalan, the Greek word for beauty, which Heidegger equates also with discipline. This harkens to the notion of being as seeming. Beauty is the coming to presence in seeming. A bit of a footnote here. Heidegger is keen to distinguish this Greek conception of beauty, which bears an interrelation to aletheia, to truth as unconcealment, and the modern aesthetic conception of beauty, which has no cognitive import because it reduces beauty purely to subjective pleasure and enjoyment. That's not this sense of beauty. This is not subjective pleasure and enjoyment. This is a form of truth, of coming to presence and seeming. So Heidegger concludes his discussion of Heraclitus with two important points on page 147. First of all, he says, saying and hearing are proper only when they are intrinsically directed in advance toward being, toward logos. Only where logos opens itself up does vocabulary become word. Only where the self-opening being of beings is apprehended does merely keeping one's ears open become hearing. In other words, those who do not attend, who are not attentive to being, do not really hear, nor do they really say. Words are empty chatter to them. At best, they're instruments that may be useful for utilitarian ends, like ordering at a restaurant. Heidegger goes on to say that poets and thinkers are the only ones who genuinely say something with their words. Everyone else in comparison to them, and this is all interpreting Heraclitus, is like dogs barking, right? You have your poets and your thinkers, and then everyone else, and their words are like dogs barking or like a donkey's hee-haw. And the second concluding point in his exposition of Heraclitus, he says, towards the bottom of page 147, being as logos is a originary gathering, not a heap or pile where everything counts just as much or just as little. And for this reason, rank and dominance belong to being. If being is to open itself up, it itself must have rank and maintain it. In other words, the gathering involved in logos is an organizing and arranging, which means a ranking in a general sense. It's not a gathering like raking leaves, but it's a gathering like sorting the wheat from the chaff, and much more than that. On page 149, he says, towards the top of the page, second paragraph, gathering is never just driving together and piling up. It maintains in a belonging together that which contends and strives in confrontation. The premier model of gathering, so understood, would be the organization of the state, which involves a hierarchy differentiated by power relations. Heidegger even baldly states on page 148 that what is higher in rank is what is stronger. What is higher in rank is what is stronger. This suggests that the struggle and the strife, the the polemos here, involved in the happening of truth, has a political component, namely the emergence into unconcealment of these rankings. The emergence into unconcealment of the state is an ongoing power struggle. Heidegger even suggests here that the weak cannot handle the truth. On page 148, middle of the page. Because being is logos, harmonia, aletheia, phusis, phanesthai, logos, harmony, unconcealment, phusis, self-showing, it shows itself in a way that is anything but arbitrary. The true is not for every man, but only for the strong. So this is Heraclitus' view of truth. Heidegger, we can assume, has a generally positive attitude towards it. Unlike the Christian concept of logos, I think we can read between the lines where Heidegger here has a generally negative attitude towards the Christian concept of the logos. At this point in his exposition, Heidegger makes a brief digression in order to say a few cursory words about the famous Christian conception of the logos. The two main points here are as follows. First, well, for Heraclitus, logos means the being of beings. For the New Testament, logos is one particular being, the logos, the Son of God. And second, this New Testament conception of the logos comes from the Hellenized Jewish philosopher Philo, who conceived of the logos as a mediating figure between humans and God. Philo used the term logos for this mediator because of the association in the Jewish religious tradition of a mediator with a messenger, and a messenger, of course, with word. In Christianity, the word is, of course, Christ himself. Christ who is crucified, and this crucifixion of Christ is the announcement or word of God to humanity, together presumably with the resurrection. That's God's word to humanity. Christ has died and risen and is Lord. What's Heidegger's comment about this view of the logos from the Christian tradition? Heidegger says, quote, "A world separates all this from Heraclitus," quote. So there's an unmistakable note of condescension in this pronouncement, but the grounds of his criticism aren't explicitly spelled out, so we'll just leave that as is. Because much more significant for Heidegger in these remarks is what he has to say about Parmenides. Following his brief remarks on the Christian logos, Heidegger turns his attention to Parmenides. And here Heidegger develops his unconventional thesis that, contrary to the traditional reading, Parmenides and Heraclitus are not opposed to one another in their basic metaphysical insights. Accordingly, Heidegger seeks to demonstrate that Parmenides was in complete agreement with Heraclitus about the union of logos and phusis. He starts his demonstration with a line from Parmenides that reads in Greek, and this is page 151. This is this Greek line, "Tokar auto knowing estin te kai enai, rather, which is translated as, but thinking and being are the same. But thinking and being are the same." So this is the line that from Heraclitus that Heidegger is going to focus on. Thinking and being are the same. So how do we understand this? Heidegger claims that in order to understand this statement, we have to know three things, and that's the top of page 153 there. You see this right up there. So refer you to that in your handy translation. We need to know what the to auto and the te kai mean. That is, what the the same means and the both and in this phrase. What does knowing mean? That's the biggie. Thinking. Translating this Greek word knowing. And what does enai mean, which is being? Einai, rather, sorry. Einai, being. One question that immediately arises about this word knowing is, what sense of thinking does Parmenides have in mind here? And Heidegger answers that this means to apprehend. To apprehend. That's the sense of thinking. To apprehend. And this has two different but related senses, and Heidegger wants to combine these into what he calls a double sense. So it can mean either, in the first sense, to take in or to let something come to oneself as that which appears. So to take in or to let come to oneself as that which appears. That's the first. Or second, it can mean to interrogate something, like a witness, in order to ascertain a state of affairs. In particular, to ascertain how things stand, he says. How things stand. So that's the second sense, to ascertain how things stand, as when you're interrogating a witness. So it can take in, to let come to oneself as that which appears. To take in something, like taking in a sunset over the Pacific Ocean, or it can mean interrogating to ascertain how things stand. And if we were to combine these two senses, we get a combined sense of letting things come to oneself, in which one does not just take things in, but takes up a position to receive what shows itself. So this is sort of more of a kind of a passive sense. It's an oversimplification, but the first is sort of taking in, to let something come to you, is the passive sense, and then the more active sense, which is to interrogate, to question. And so if we combine these, we get this combined sense, letting things come to oneself, but a letting come to oneself in which one does not just take things in, but rather takes up a position to receive what shows itself. So we're combining two senses here that are really kind of in tension with one another, and as a result, this multiplies the difficulties of understanding what he has in mind. He gives a kind of analogy here that might be helpful on page 153. He says, when troops take up a position to receive the enemy, then they want to meet the enemy that is coming towards them, and meet him in such a way that they at least bring him to a halt, a stand. Knowing involves this receptive bringing to a stand of that which appears. Now, this line from Parmenides, togar auto knowing estin tekai einais, being is the same as thinking. It says that apprehending is the same as being. What's the same here? The same refers to a kind of oneness, but rather than to indifferent identity or self-sameness, it's the belonging together of what strives in opposition. The belonging together of what strives in opposition. So that's what this means. Thinking and being are the same, meaning they belong together in oppositional striving, we could put it that way. That's how he's understanding the same here. So knowing, now what we've got is apprehending and being belong together in this oppositional striving. That's how Heidegger's understanding this. In other words, for Parmenides, being and apprehending are unified in the sense of striving in opposition to each other. This also means that when being holds sway, apprehending holds sway as well. And it also means that apprehending belongs to, according to Heidegger in his reading of Parmenides, belongs to physis. It happens for the sake of being. Thus, it is an error, or would be an error if we made it, to regard apprehending as a function of the cognitive faculty of an apprehending subject, a subject that grasps its object and therefore apprehends it, right, in scare quotes. Just as apprehending belongs to the sway of being for physis, so too does the human being. The human being is not in control of being in its apprehension. Rather, the human being is under being's control. Commenting on Parmenides' statement, Heidegger says on page 155, the statement says nothing directly about human beings, certainly nothing about the human being as subject, and nothing whatsoever about a subject that absorbs everything objective into something subjective. The statement says the opposite of all that. Being holds sway, but because it holds sway, and insofar as it holds sway and appears, apprehending also necessarily happens, along with appearance. But if human beings have a part in the happening of this appearance and apprehending, then they must themselves be, they must belong to being. But then the essence and the manner of being human can be determined only on the basis of the essence of being. So Heidegger's philosophical stance here constitutes a reversal of Cartesian solipsism or idealistic world constitution. The world is not my representation. Instead, I belong to the world and depend upon it for my being. If I apprehend the world, this is a gift that I receive from being. My subjectivity, whatever that may be, is similarly something that's imparted to me by being. Another way to put this is, I don't possess my apprehensions. Instead, they possess me. I belong to my apprehensions. I belong to them. As Heidegger says, apprehending is the happening that has the human being. Heidegger links apprehending to the taking in of the essence of the human. This essence is apprehending in and through not an interruption, but an eruption of being itself, an appearing that is apprehended. Now, Heidegger makes three observations about the unique status that the question, what is the human being, has. On page 156, he says, 1, the determination of the essence of the human being is never an answer, but is essentially a question. 2, the asking of this question and its decision are historical, not just in general, but as the essence of history. 3, the question of who the human being is must always be posed in an essential connection with the question of how it stands with being. The question of the human being is not an anthropological question, but a historically metaphysical question. Why is the determination of the essence of the human being never an answer, but always a question? Because the essence of the human being is to question its essence. Our essence is to question our essence. Heidegger says on page 160 that, quote, humanity first comes to itself and is a self only as questioning historical. Humanity first comes to itself and is a self only as questioning historical. To take the essence of the human as an unquestionable ahistorical fact is, therefore, to miss the essence. This essence is historical. It is an event, a happening, that occurs with the appearance of being. It's not something fixed for all time and eternity. The essence of the humanity, is something that happens in history. Thus, the question, what is the human being, is a historical, metaphysical question about being, or physis. It goes along with the questioning of being. It's not an anthropological or other type of scientific question. So, as Heidegger says on 160 through 161, he says in the bottom, 160 starting there, who is the human being? We do not learn this through a scholarly definition, but only when humanity steps into the confrontation with beings by attempting to bring them into their being, that is, sets beings into limits and forms, projects something new, not yet present, originally poetizes, grounds poetically. For human beings, the question, what is the human being, must take the form, who is the human being? Who is the human being? This is because it's a question that only the human being can ask, and it is asked by a human being about its own being. This is not a scientific or scholarly question to be given a scientific or scholarly answer. Rather, it is an existential question that can only be answered in and through the human being taking up its own stance in relation to being. This is the sense in which, for Parmenides, thinking and being are the same. Namely, what this means, according to Heidegger, is the apprehending that the human essentially belongs to is in unifying struggle with being. Its most originary sense is belonging together reciprocally are apprehending and being. As Heidegger says on page 162, quote, belonging together reciprocally are apprehending and being. Apprehending and being belong together reciprocally. So this concludes this video, and we'll conclude it with the third discussion question. Third discussion question. Do you agree with Heidegger about the unique status and features of the question, what is the human being? Do you agree that this question is necessarily historical, metaphysical, not scholarly or scientific? What is the unifying struggle with being in which human essence is determined? How is this struggle a form of apprehending? How does it take place? So the third discussion question, once again, do you agree with Heidegger about the unique status and features of the question, what is the human being? Do you agree that this question is necessarily historical, metaphysical, not scholarly or scientific? What is the unifying struggle with being in which the human essence is determined? How is this struggle a form of apprehending? How does it take place?